Hank, with a relaxed grin, leaned back in his seat, observing the alien display with a blend of curiosity and his usual audacious self-assurance. This casual confidence made the alien crew visibly uncomfortable. Their mission, seemingly straightforward on paper, involved an exploratory scan of a previously uncharted zone near the Grixon Nebula. Drones had mapped the area, but no living being had ever traversed it, at least not one to return. Bruckar, the meticulous tele-diplomat, narrowed her eyes at Hank, her upper mandibles clicking nervously. Beside her, Grikkar, a Zarian scientist known for his extreme caution, couldn't decide if Hank was incredibly brave or simply out of his mind. "We'll follow the established course," Grikkar stated firmly, indicating the holographic projection of a winding path that cautiously avoided all potential hazards. Hank chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That'll add 2 days to our journey. Why not just go this way?" He traced a finger across a faint, dangerous-looking line on the map, a shortcut directly through zones labeled high risk, rife with unknown gravitational anomalies and extreme radiation. Bruckar's eye stalks widened. "A shortcut? That area is uncharted, completely unexplored. You could trigger a gravitational collapse." Hank shrugged nonchalantly. "Or we'll save a day. Maybe more. Look, this isn't my first rodeo." His casual tone, intended to reassure, sounded to Bruckar and Grikkar like he was dismissing certain death as a minor inconvenience. "And this a rodeo?" Grikkar murmured skeptically, crossing his multiple arms. "You suggest going directly into areas where our drones detected energy readings equivalent to collapsing stars. This is not a human shortcut, it's a—" "It'll be fine," Hank interrupted, flashing a confident smile. "Trust me." Bruckar froze, exchanging a horrified glance with Grikkar. For them, the phrase "it'll be fine" was practically a declaration of impending disaster. Every Teller and Zarian protocol they had ever studied warned against even entertaining the notion of an uncharted route without extensive cycles of meticulous analysis and rigorous testing. Abandoning their carefully planned course for the impulsive whims of a human shortcut felt like willingly jumping into the unknown abyss. Yet, something in Hank's eyes, whether reckless optimism or unwavering certainty, silenced their protests. They glanced at each other again, uncertainty flickering in their gazes. With a reluctant nod from Bruckar, they acquiesced to Hank's audacious proposal. After all, he was the human expert, and it was well known that humans seemed to thrive on chaos, navigating even the most precarious environments as if they were merely intriguing puzzles to be solved. As they entered the shortcut, Grikkar gripped the console, his scales flickering with anxiety. An eerie silence filled the control room, punctuated only by Hank's casual humming as he skillfully dodged fragments of a massive asteroid belt. Grikkar was convinced his demise was imminent. "Would you mind ceasing that humming?" Grikkar snapped, his voice trembling as a particularly large asteroid drifted precariously close. Unperturbed, Hank adjusted their trajectory with a subtle flick of the controls. "Relax, Professor," he replied with a grin, "you'll frighten the ship." Bruckar's multiple eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of Hank's approach. "Is this typical human behavior?" she whispered to Grikkar, hoping for some explanation. Grikkar shook his head, equally bewildered. "If this is normal for humans, we may have severely underestimated their resilience, or perhaps their disregard for their own safety." Meanwhile, Hank charted a new course through a swirling, dark nebula. "See, Bruckar, the trick with shortcuts is to focus on where you're going, not what you're trying to avoid. We'll be through this nebula in a jiffy." Bruckar squirmed as they plunged into the murky depths. The space felt suffocating, visibility reduced to almost nothing. She exchanged a worried glance with Grikkar, only to find him engrossed in analyzing the energy anomalies swirling around them. "Watch this," Hank said with a wink. Before Bruckar could object, he boosted the thrusters, sending the ship into a dizzying spiral. Gravitational waves rippled around them, turning the ship into a wild, cosmic rollercoaster. The alien duo clung to anything they could find, sensors flashing alarming warnings. "Human," Grikkar managed, clinging to the console, "do you intend for us to survive this, or are you simply reckless enough to believe that it'll be fine?" Hank interrupted cheerfully, maneuvering past another energy surge with a laugh. "Trust me, you two worry too much. Brukar and Grikar exchanged looks of pure, unadulterated horror. How could any species find this remotely enjoyable? They were fairly certain their skeletal structures were about to give way. But Hank maintained a cool, collected smile throughout, as if navigating this deadly, unexplored sector was no different than a leisurely stroll. As they finally cleared the nebula, Grikar's screens pinged with a dozen threats detected, but thankfully, avoided. Brukar's legs felt weak, her mind reeling with disbelief. Even Grikar seemed momentarily speechless. See? Hank leaned back triumphantly. We're a third of the way through in half the time, and no casualties. Just another day at the office. Grikar could only shake his head, muttering something about human unpredictability. Brukar muttered under her breath, "How do they survive this?" Hank overheard her and chuckled, giving her shoulder a reassuring pat. "Well, like I said, it'll be fine." Neither Brukar nor Grikar looked convinced. They had a sneaking suspicion that the word fine held a drastically different connotation for humans. The shortcut might shave off precious time, but merely surviving the experience seemed like a monumental task in itself. And indeed, the shortcut swiftly devolved into a gauntlet of pure stress for the two aliens. They watched in abject horror as their scanners blared, warning of an incoming meteor storm. Brukar's anxiety spiked with each ominous blip on the radar. Meteor cluster approaching. Estimated impact in, hold on, Hank announced calmly, flicking a few switches with nonchalant ease. He adjusted the shields to a level that neither alien had even considered. If we time this just right, we can slip right through without a scratch. Slip through? Brukar's voice nearly cracked. She watched in terror as they approached the storm, each rocky projectile a potential death sentence. Yet, Hank's confidence remained unshakable. He navigated through the storm with an almost preternatural precision, dodging each meteor as though he'd practiced the maneuver countless times. Grikar, who had forgotten to breathe at some point, clung to his console with all his might. This is insane. Statistically improbable. We should be dust by now. Stats, Hank laughed, narrowly avoiding a meteor twice the size of their ship. Statistics don't account for courage, Professor. Or, intuition. Brukar shivered. Human intuition is terrifying. A particularly large meteor loomed directly in their path, and Brukar braced for the inevitable. She closed her multiple eyes, envisioning the ship's vaporization. But Hank simply adjusted their angle and momentarily cut the engines, allowing them to drift safely around the massive space rock. Brukar opened her eyes, incredulous. "How?" she demanded, her voice laced with disbelief. "Sometimes you just gotta cut the engines and let gravity do its thing," Hank explained with a shrug. "Or maybe I just got lucky." He winked, as if sheer luck was the only explanation required. As the ship emerged from the meteor storm, Brukar let out a shaky breath. "We survived that. See?" Hank grinned. "No biggie." Brukar and Grikar shared a glance, mentally cataloguing every near-death experience Hank had so casually dismissed as a no biggie. They concluded that if there were a universal scale for acceptable risk, humans would be exponentially off the charts. As they pressed onward, the ship's sensors picked up unusual light signals up ahead. The readings were erratic, punctuated by powerful energy spikes that set Grikar's scales pulsing with anxiety. "Human, we are detecting unidentified energy emissions. Hostile signatures are likely." Hank studied the monitor, a thoughtful expression on his face. Interesting. Let's take a closer look." Brukar felt a chill run down her spine. "A closer look? You mean go towards it?" "Why not?" Hank replied. "Sometimes the quickest way out is through." He adjusted their course towards the energy signatures before either Brukar or Grikar could formulate a protest. The sensor readings intensified, the control room flashing with alarming red warnings. "This is madness," Grikar whispered, clutching his head. "Absolute madness." Hank simply chuckled, giving them a reassuring thumbs up. "Relax, I got this." As they approached the source, the ship's lights began to flicker, reacting to the powerful energy waves. The previously empty space now swirled with strange lights and vague, shadowy forms that seemed to move with predatory intent. Brookar's scales prickled with unease. She could almost feel unseen creatures lurking, waiting to strike. She bit her lip, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you certain about this?" "Absolutely," Hank replied, his voice remarkably calm as he steered the ship through the turbulent energy waves. "This stuff is just for show." Brookar's heart hammered in her chest as a large shadow swept past the ship, causing the hull to shudder. "For show? This looks like certain death." "Death schmeth," Hank quipped, squinting at the shadows. "You just gotta ignore it. If you don't act like prey, nothing out here will treat you like one." Brooker covered his eyes, unwilling to witness what he was sure would be their demise. Hank's hands moved over the controls with preternatural calm, weaving the ship through the waves of energy with unexplainable confidence. Then, as suddenly as it began, the strange energy phenomenon ceased. The lights and shadows vanished, leaving them floating in the calm void of space. Brooker and Grekar exchanged bewildered glances, slowly lowering their hands from whatever they had been gripping. "See? I told you it'd be fine." Hank's smile was as bright as ever. Brooker could barely speak. "How is that fine? What kind of species willingly risks obliteration and then calls it fine?" Hank just chuckled, setting them back on course. "You aliens are so uptight. Where's your sense of adventure?" "Adventure?" Grekar hissed, still trembling. "You call that terrifying ordeal an adventure?" "Yep," Hank replied without missing a beat. "You never discover anything new without taking a few chances, right?" Brooker and Grekar slumped in their seats, exchanging another look of pure disbelief. To Hank, the life-threatening chaos of the shortcut was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a necessary evil to shave off some travel time, not a near-death experience. As they continued deeper into the uncharted territory, the ship's sensors detected a strange, cloud-like anomaly ahead. The readings were erratic, fluctuating widely with every passing moment. "It appears we've stumbled upon a region of hyperreactive particles," Grekar announced, his voice tinged with a hint of alarm. "Any sudden movements, any propulsion, could trigger a chain reaction." Hank glanced at the readings, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "So, no engines then? Just got adrift?" "Precisely," Brooker confirmed, her usual meticulous composure faltering slightly. "Moving too quickly could cause an explosion capable of obliterating us." Hank grinned, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Drifting, who?" "Like a lazy river." "No problem. Quieter this way, too. No engine noise." Brooker and Grekar stared at him, bewildered. A lazy river? Did this human have no comprehension of the gravity of their situation? Grekar's scales pulsed a worried purple, while Brooker's multiple eyes scanned the monitors, desperately searching for any indication that Hank's nonchalance was justified. With the engines powered down, the ship began to drift slowly through the shimmering cloud of particles. Grekar held his breath, watching nervously as the glowing specks danced around the hull, their touch delicate, almost playful. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. Perhaps Hank was right. Perhaps they would simply glide through unscathed. But then, a flicker of movement on the main display screen caught his attention. What is that?" Brooker whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. A large, shadowy figure drifted into view, its form partially obscured by the swirling particles. It resembled a massive creature, something ancient and powerful, gliding through the field as if they were prey in its hunting grounds. "Oh, that's just a big space critter," Hank said calmly, though one hand remained poised over the controls. "We'll just stay quiet, nice and easy, and it won't even notice us." Brooker and Grekar stared at him, dumbfounded. "Stay quiet? That thing could swallow their ship whole." "Just stay quiet?" Brooker stammered, barely managing to contain her panic. "Only if we give it a reason to," Hank reassured her with a smile. "Big things like that, they don't usually bother with smaller things unless provoked." "Smaller things?" Brooker thought, glancing at their ship, dwarfed by the creature's immense size. This was lunacy. "Just breathe," Hank advised, his gaze fixed on the creature as they drifted closer. "We're just a speck in its world. Besides, haven't you ever heard of laying low? Sometimes the best way to stay safe is to stay out of sight." Gricar swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the approaching behemoth. His mind raced, calculating probabilities, each equation culminating in near-certain disaster. But Hank's steady hand on the controls offered a strange, almost comforting reassurance, even as every rational thought screamed impending doom. And then, miraculously, the creature drifted past, completely oblivious to their presence. Its immense form faded into the depths of the shimmering cloud, leaving their ship unharmed. Gricar released a shaky breath, while Brucar sat frozen, eyes wide with disbelief. "We survived," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "See?" Hank grinned, nudging her playfully. "Told you. Sometimes, doing nothing is the best strategy." Gricar stared at Hank, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. I don't understand." Every calculation indicated. Hank shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "Not everything is about numbers, Professor. Sometimes it's about instinct. Feeling the situation out." "Feeling it out?" Gricar repeated, as if the concept were entirely foreign, which, to him, it was. "There's a lot out here you can't predict or control," Hank continued, his voice calm, almost philosophical, as he gazed out at the glowing expanse. "So you just go with it." The silence lingered, heavy with the weight of the near encounter. Brucar finally shook her head, a chuckle escaping her despite her fear. Only a human would drift through a hyperreactive particle field, in the presence of a gigantic, potentially hostile creature, and call it going with it. Hank chuckled along with her. "What can I say? It's the human way." Brucar and Gricar exchanged glances. They weren't sure if they had just witnessed a miracle, an act of sheer insanity, or some bizarre combination of both. But as the ship finally emerged from the shimmering cloud, Brucar had to admit, if only to herself, that Hank's human way seemed to have a peculiar effectiveness. Emerging from the particle cloud, a brief respite settled over the crew. Brucar and Gricar, still reeling from their close encounter with the gargantuan space creature, began to believe they might actually make it through Hank's shortcut alive. This fragile piece, however, was short-lived. Their sensors detected a new anomaly, a large, dark structure looming ahead, shrouded in a hazy nebula. Even from a distance, it emanated an aura of ancient power and mystery. "Hold on, is that an old fortress?" Hank's voice held a note of intrigue, his eyes lighting up as he leaned closer to the display. "Wow, we gotta check this out." Brucar's mandibles clacked in alarm. "Check it out? That thing could be filled with dangerous traps, ancient defenses. Who knows what's lurking inside?" Gricar's scales pulsed with worry as he added, "There's no way to predict the security measures of such an ancient structure." "This isn't a sightseeing tour, Hank." Ignoring their apprehension, Hank steered the ship toward the fortress, a wide grin on his face. "Oh, come on. When do you ever get a chance like this? We might find something valuable. Or at least something cool." Brucar stared at him, incredulous. "Cool?" No sane individual would describe that fortress as cool. As they approached, the ship's console lit up with warning signals. The fortress walls were lined with deactivated cannons and dormant defense drones, a testament to its formidable past. "See? Probably all deactivated," Hank said, his tone far too casual for Brucar and Gricar's comfort. Gricar gripped his console, barely breathing. "And if they aren't?" Hank winked. "Then we'll improvise." Brucar nearly shrieked. "Improvise? This isn't the time for improvisation." Hank maneuvered the ship into a cautious hover near a small platform extending from the fortress wall. The walls towered above them, casting long, ominous shadows. The silence was heavy with anticipation. Brucar scanned the fortress for any sign of movement, while Gricar offered a silent prayer. Hank initiated a scan. The fortress appeared deserted, devoid of life signs or energy readings. Just as Bruckar began to relax, a red light flashed on the console. Energy spike detected, Bruckar whispered, his voice strained. It's activating something. Oh good. Hank exclaimed, seemingly unfazed. Maybe we'll get a guided tour. He punched in a few commands, stabilizing the ship. Bruckar's patience snapped. A guided tour? Hank, we need to leave immediately. But Hank had already landed the ship on the platform. Before Bruckar could protest further, he unbuckled his harness, grabbed his helmet and gestured for them to follow. Come on. Who knows what treasures we'll find? You wanted an adventure, right? Hank's grin bordered on reckless abandon. I wanted to survive, Bruckar muttered, reluctantly grabbing her own protective gear. As they stepped onto the platform, a low hum filled the air. The fortress wall shifted and groaned, ancient mechanisms whirring back to life as a passage opened before them. Hank strode forward without hesitation, while Bruckar and Bruckar exchanged another look of trepidation. They entered a dimly lit corridor adorned with unfamiliar glyphs and symbols. Hank, unfazed, ran a hand along the wall. So, anyone recognize the language? He asked casually. Bruckar's voice was tight with anxiety. Why would we? This structure predates recorded history. You shouldn't even be touching anything. Lighten up, Hank grinned, tapping one of the symbols. To their astonishment, the symbol lit up, casting a soft blue glow down the corridor. Hank smirked. See? No big deal. Bruckar could barely speak. Every step we take here could trigger a deadly trap. Or worse. As if on cue, a grinding sound echoed through the corridor, and hidden doors opened, releasing a cloud of gas. Bruckar yelped, covering her face, while Bruckar's scales flushed with panic. Relax, Hank said, pulling out a small device. Standard issue rebreather. You guys have these, right? Bruckar and Bruckar stared at him, dumbfounded. No, Bruckar choked out. Hank chuckled, tossing them each a rebreather. Always prepared. That's the human way. They quickly donned the devices and followed Hank deeper into the fortress. Bruckar's heart pounded, her mind racing with the sheer improbability of their situation. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. The corridor opened into a vast chamber filled with ancient relics, strange devices, and towering statues that seemed to watch them with hollow eyes. Hank let out a low whistle. Look at this place. It's a gold mine. Bruckar's nerves were frayed. A gold mine? We're trespassing in a tomb. Hank's eyes sparkled with excitement. Tomb, treasure trove, same difference. And hey, look at these markings. Doesn't this look like some kind of instruction manual? Bruckar could only stare, speechless. The entire fortress screamed danger, yet Hank treated it like a museum exhibit. Human instincts are beyond comprehension, Bruckar whispered, watching Hank with a mixture of awe and terror. Whatever they found in that fortress, one thing was clear, Hank wasn't leaving empty-handed. As they navigated the ancient chamber, filled with towering relics and strange devices, a low hum permeated the air, each artifact radiating a subtle, otherworldly energy. Bruckar and Bruckar struggled to contain their apprehension as Hank strolled among these unknown objects, a relaxed grin on his face, touching switches and handles as if browsing a store. Careful! Bruckar hissed, her multiple eyes darting nervously between the imposing statues that seemed to glare at them, warning against disturbing the ancient peace of the chamber. Relax, Hank replied dismissively, gesturing towards a complex console. Look at this. This thing probably hasn't been touched in millennia. Exactly, Bruckar agreed, his voice strained with anxiety. For all we know, it's designed to vaporize anyone who dares to touch it. Hank chuckled, seemingly unfazed by the prospect. And yet, here we are, still breathing. He confidently pressed a few buttons on the console. To their astonishment, a hidden panel in the wall slid open, revealing a gleaming, cylindrical object covered in intricate markings. Bruckar's eye stalks widened. Is that a weapon? Could be, Hank shrugged, picking it up and examining it closely. Or maybe it's just a really fancy paperweight. He rotated the cylinder, studying the engravings. The object emitted a soft glow, and Bruckar swore she saw it pulsate as though it were alive. "Stop," she cried, her voice filled with alarm. "Hank, that thing could have dire consequences. Put it back." Hank looked at her with amusement. "Dire consequences?" "Bruckar, it's a relic, probably a souvenir from some forgotten civilization. Whatever it was, it's not a threat anymore." Before Bruckar could argue further, the cylinder began to vibrate, emitting a low hum that rapidly intensified. Bruckar's scales flushed a deep red with panic. He backed away quickly, pulling Bruckar with him behind one of the massive statues. "Put it down!" Bruckar shouted, his voice strained with terror. "That could be a self-destruct mechanism." All right, Hank said, rolling his eyes good-naturedly. He carefully placed the cylinder back on the pedestal. The humming ceased almost immediately. He turned back to the aliens, a mischievous grin on his face. "See? No harm done." "No harm?" Bruckar sputtered, her mandibles clicking furiously. "We were moments away from oblivion, and you call that no harm done?" Hank simply shrugged. "Hey, you're both still in one piece, aren't you?" He winked and turned towards the exit, leaving Bruckar and Bruckar to exchange a look of utter exasperation. After a moment, they followed, cautiously watching Hank as if he were a walking catastrophe waiting to happen. They carefully navigated their way back through the fortress, avoiding pressure plates, laser grids, and other hidden traps. Hank seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense danger, sidestepping threats as if he'd memorized the fortress's layout. Bruckar and Bruckar, however, remained on edge, every step feeling like a potential misstep into oblivion. Finally, they reached their ship and climbed aboard, the fortress looming behind them like a dark, ominous presence. Bruckar collapsed into his seat, exhausted, while Bruckar sat in stunned silence, still processing the ordeal. "All right," Hank announced cheerfully, powering up the engines. "Let's get back on track." As the ship ascended from the platform, Bruckar glanced back at the fortress, half expecting it to explode or unleash some ancient horror. But it remained silent, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of stars. He released a shaky breath, still bewildered by their escape. "I cannot comprehend how you do this," Bruckar muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and confusion. "Humans are truly unpredictable." "Hey, sometimes you gotta take a few chances," Hank replied, flashing his characteristic grin. "That's how you find the good stuff." Bruckar crossed her arms, shaking her head. "In my culture, we have a saying, he who walks into fire without caution finds only ashes." You, Hank, seemed determined to ignore every conceivable danger. "Yeah, well," Hank chuckled, "I guess that's just the human way." They continued in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Bruckar and Bruckar still couldn't quite grasp Hank's casual approach to life-threatening situations. Every decision he'd made seemed like a reckless gamble, yet, against all odds, it had worked. As they neared the end of the shortcut, Bruckar finally turned to Hank, unable to suppress her curiosity. "Do you ever experience fear? Or are all humans like you?" Hank considered her question for a moment, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Fear? Sure. But here's the thing, Bruckar, fear is just a suggestion. It doesn't mean you have to obey it all the time." Bruckar let out a low hum, clearly perplexed. "Your species defies all logic." "Maybe," Hank conceded with a shrug. "But you have to admit, we made it through, didn't we?" Bruckar couldn't argue with that. Despite his recklessness, Hank had successfully guided them through every obstacle. She leaned back, her mind reeling from the sheer improbability of it all. As the stars stretched out before them, Bruckar muttered to himself, "How can a species so chaotic survive for so long?" Hank laughed, glancing back at him over his shoulder. "Simple. We just keep going." They emerged from the shortcut into clear, open space. Bruckar exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. A small smile crept onto her face. You know, she admitted, against every instinct, every warning, and every bit of logic we possess, you were right. Hank's grin was wide and unapologetic. Told you we'd be fine. G'Kar shook his head, still muttering to himself as he gazed out at the endless expanse of the cosmos. They were alive, against all odds. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, there was something to be learned from this peculiar human way.